Strength coaches, should you teach your athletes to squat with your knees in or with your knees out? We're gonna go over this and we're gonna start right now. I'm Olympic strength coach Dane Miller. One of the biggest factors that I've seen in athletes is that being at multiple world championships, coaching at the Olympics, helping coaches and athletes develop comprehensive programs to create state champs, to create NCAA All-Americans, to get to the professional level. A lot of athletes squat differently. And I'm gonna bring up a very specific point here is that Coach Haley Reichert. Haley Reichert went on and she became a world bronze medalist in the clean and jerk as a 49K lifter, okay? And Haley was the first female from the United States to medal at the Youth World Championships, the Junior World Championships, and the Senior World Championships. And one thing with Haley is that oftentimes when she would squat, her knees would cave. Okay, so her knees would cave. A lot of people would say, oh my God, look at her knees. She's gonna blow out her ACL. All of these things are gonna happen. You gotta target her glutes. And the crazy part about this was that we would do single leg squats, which is not super common for a weightlifter. She could single leg squat as a body weight of like 50 kilos, like 100 kilos for a set of 4 on each leg, which is just outrageous, okay? Her glutes were extraordinarily strong. Very strong. She also would go through consistent testing with a local guy who was one of our main resources for her mobility and for her neural activation. Glutes were always extremely strong. Her quads were jacked. Her quads were always extremely strong. Shoulders, everything, right? Coaches would consistently say, don't let her knees cave in. These bad things will happen. And so I would sort of argue, like a lot of people would say it's because of the research that when you have a valgus knee from contact or from running at full speed, it might be more prone to an ACL injury or a knee problem of some type. But I never really believed that was the case when someone was squatting. And so fortunately for us, the knees out or knees in, volitional lateral versus medial hip rotation during barbell squats. This is a paper that came out last year. And they ended up breaking down some of these key aspects. And they could see what was happening when the knees went out in a squat and what was happening when the knees went in. And the argument I would make here, right off the bat, because there was also a weightlifter, I spent a lot of time when I would go to these world championships with Haley, with Jacob Horst, with the other USA team members that we've developed here at Garage Strength, is that I would look at how these other athletes were squatting. At the world championships, if they were in the weight room, when they would squat and come out of the hole or come out of that 90-degree range, sometimes their knees would cave in just a little bit. You would see it happening. And so I started to think about this and I'm going, okay, there's a weightlifter from Uzbekistan she was a female that weighed, like 67 or I guess 71 now is what the weight class was, she could clean and jerk like 130 kilos and she was super valgus with her knees and she was one of the best in the world. I'm going, all right, Haley does this. Some of my other athletes do this with their knees. Some athletes don't do this with their knees. I've seen sprinters do this with their knees. I've seen football players not do it, football players do it. And if we're always teaching this crazy knee out movement pattern, what's actually happening here? And so in this paper, what I think we need to look at is, as a strength coach, is that there's a difference between teaching a pattern and then when the athlete executes that pattern over a long period of time, you can see how someone makes progress. And so some athletes will execute a full range of motion, high bar back squat where their knees go forward, their butt goes forward, their trunk comes down. And some athletes might have the knees track perfectly. Some athletes might have the knees cave in. Some athletes might even have their knees go out. As a coach, we have to figure out what's the best way to teach the technique. Okay, so teach the technique, and then over time, what's the best way to just be aware of the individual's movement patterns? And so this is where it's going to take us, right? Is that should we be cueing the knees in? Should we be cueing the knees out? Or what can we be aware of as a strength coach? What did they find so that we can directly apply this? So what they went into here is that medial or lateral hip rotation may be present during barbell back squats. Okay, so medial or lateral hip rotation, which could affect the hip frontal and transverse plane moments. They had 14 males, 15 females. That these subjects perform squats using their normal technique and with volitional medial or lateral hip rotation. So the hip net joint moments were calculated from three-dimensional motion capture and force platform measurements. So they're looking at what's the force output when they go knees out, what's the force output when they go knees in, where are they seeing differences in the application as well from the individual. So they set the statistical significance and they corrected for a couple other comparisons, and then they looked at, okay, normal squats required hip extensor, adductor, and lateral rotator, NJM, okay, so net joint moments. Okay, so when we're looking at this, lateral rotation of the hips, okay, is when the knees go out, medial is when the knees come in, and then they're gonna look at this and they'll say, okay, lateral rotation squats had smaller hip extensors, okay, so a little bit less hamstring involvement. Lateral rotators and larger hip adductors, so more groin targeting, more groin activation, right? So if you know, somebody like myself who I can squat basically with my knees or with my feet touching, if I squat with my knees out, my groin will be extraordinarily sore, like just ungodly sore if the knees are out. So think about that. The groin is gonna be targeted quite a bit more and it's gonna be more active if the knees are out, okay? So medial rotation, so knees in, had smaller hip extensor and adductor net joint moments and larger hip lateral rotator net joint moments than normal squats. So these, which is the glutes, okay? So the glutes were actually more active when the knees were in. And so right off the bat, it's amusing because people would comment on Haley's videos when her knees would cave and they'd be like, one, she's gonna blow out her knees, which never happened. And then two, oh my gosh, you're hindering her strength. She back squatted like 156 at a body weight of 51 kilos. And then three, her glutes and her quads aren't that strong. And it's like, well, funny, because one, her glutes were extraordinarily strong. Two, in this paper, they're showing us that actually when the knees are caving, there's more glute activation. So the glutes are actually stronger in this movement pattern than normal back squats. So these differences exceeded the minimum effects that were worth detecting. So glute max exerts hip extensor and lateral rotator moments, and the adductor magnus exerts hip extensor and adductor moments as well. So these muscles combined would be required to meet these hip demands. Okay, so if the knees are out, more adductor action, right? These muscles combined would be required to meet these hip demands. Lateral rotation squats, reduce hip lateral rotator and increase hip adductors, which we just mentioned, the adductor magnus, and then medial rotation squats right here. So knees in, medial rotation squats increase hip lateral rotator and decrease hip adductor. So less groin. Therefore, this variant may shift loading to the glute max. Knees in may shift loading to the glute max, but her glutes are so weak. If your knees cave, your glutes are so weak. And that was one thing that I would see consistently, even with sprinters at world championships or at the Olympics, they would squat and their knees would cave a little bit when they would come out of the squat. But they also have extraordinarily strong glutes. They also have strong quads. And I think that the overarching thought process here, okay, as a strength coach, how can we take this information and roll with it? One, the first thing that I was thinking is like, okay, if we're looking at like bodybuilders and they're squatting with their let's say their knees almost close together with a very narrow foot stance, they're gonna get quads and glute activation from full range of motion when they're doing this, right? Like that's what bodybuilders do. They'll squat. If they have small glutes and small quads, they'll squat very, very narrow, full range of motion. They get a lot of stimulation in their glutes and in their quads, which is what we see here. If I have an athlete who, let's talk about a thrower or even potentially like someone like an ice hockey player, some throwers will get issues in their groin. Some ice hockey players might have some problems in their groin as well for different reasons. If we squat with our knees out, as a variation, we can target the groin to strengthen it based off of what we're seeing here. Okay, so we can strengthen or heal that problem area with this style of squatting. So that's like the first application point. The second point is that I'm not saying we should be teaching people to squat with their knees touching or teaching people to squat with their knees out. I think I like to have the toes out slightly wider than shoulder width apart. I like full range of motion, high bar back squats or front squats to be the first thing that we teach. And we're gonna back squat, we're gonna front squat, and we're gonna do single leg squats. Then what we do after a long period of time, if a specific pattern starts to develop, is it like a genetic pattern, which is ironic with Haley's situation because her brother would squat very similar to her, and we could try to work around it and just make sure, keep an eye on it. Is there an issue here? If we have somebody whose knees go out, typically they might dump their chest a little bit more as well, and it's not as common to see that, but that does happen at times. And I also think it happens because of usually a lack of mobility in their ankle as well. So I think the biggest thing to take from this is like just being aware, and when someone goes for a max attempt and their knees come in, it's because they're transferring the load to muscles that are stronger in their specific makeup to try to recruit and to try and manipulate the bar to stand it up. Okay, so we've just got to keep that in mind. And then when we're doing jumps and we're doing sprints and stuff, just be aware of this. It's not going to be the make or break as people have talked about with knees in or knees out. Ultimately, if you squat with your knees in, at heavier loads or you squat with your knees out, it's really gonna be about the way that your motor patterns have developed based off of your frame and based off of your body. And it's not a negative in one way or the other. We can just be aware that adductors might be weaker or adductors might be stronger, or glutes might be weaker or glutes might be stronger from one type of squat to the other. And I think that's the big thing that we've got to keep aware of, is that as we continue to program and we make stable athletes, we've got to make sure that they can move at high speeds through full range of motion in different motor patterns, and then that's going to create a freak athlete. And that's exactly what we do inside of our strength training app, Peak Strength. We build programming around high speed movements like weightlifting derivatives, technical coordination movements, plyometrics, sprints. We get into heavy weighted training, high load back squats, front squats, anything along those lines to help improve sports performance. If you guys need help with your strength training, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. You can download Peak Strength today, because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.